Welcome to Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI, a podcast from Paul Weiss featuring your hosts, Katherine, Forrest, and Anna Gressel. The only update you need on AI policy, law, and governance starts now.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI. I'm Katherine Forrest.
And I'm Anna Gressel.
And Anna, okay, I feel like we should have a whole episode dedicated to interviewing you about where you have been. Where have you been? Tell us.
So I'm back in New York now, but I was previously in what was a very sunny Berlin and then a very, very, very sunny Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So it was super fun to be on the road for a little bit. I was speaking at a conference called GITEX in Berlin on a bunch of different topics, including AI agents, and then headed off to Abu Dhabi and Dubai to run some roundtables for GCs on AI agents, which is really just such an interesting topic, Katherine. It's like, I know we talk about it all the time, but every week there's a new development. Every week there's something new to unpack. And, you know, the UAE is just doing interesting things too. So it's always fun to be there and listen and hear what is happening and what people are thinking about there as well.
Yeah, you know, there is really so much happening in AI agents, and I'm jealous that you were able to go and talk about it for these various roundtables. Today, however, I'm going to capture you as a captive audience to talk about agents with us and to talk about the Claude Opus 4 and Claude Sonnet, the Claude 4 family. And it's an agentic, very powerful and highly capable model. So we'll talk about that today. And then also just yesterday, in terms of the day we're taping this on June 10th. And so just yesterday, Apple released a paper that is different from, of course, the Claude 4 world, but also about capabilities. And it's called The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. So I thought we would dive into that and take advantage of some of your agentic thoughts and words of wisdom on all of this.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'm excited to talk about the Apple paper because I don't know about you, Katherine, but it is like all over my social media as well. And all the folks I follow on LinkedIn are talking about it. So it's a moment to really unpack what that means. I'm sure many of our listeners will have seen that at least bumping around over there. But I think, you know, there's so much to be excited about these days. And in terms of the Opus 4 model, it's more intelligent as a base LLM, and it's a reasoner. And in addition to that, it's more integrated with external tools and more agentic than its predecessor. So we can like unpack what that means in practice.
Yeah, let's unpack what it means to be more agentic. I mean, I know one thing before you get into it. One thing that Claude Opus 4 can do is it can actually use tools in parallel. It can actually send out requests for tool use to accomplish parts of a problem all at once. So it's not doing serial tool use. It's with a single agent doing parallel tool use. But tell me what more agentic means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good point. And backing up, one of the things we talk a lot about when we do presentations or roundtables on agents is the fact that agents exist really on a spectrum of capability. And so even though there are a lot of things being marketed as agents right now, there are meaningful differences in terms of what those agents can do and how they can accomplish those tasks, like tool use, for example. So, you know, as we see more and more LLMs have some sort of agentic capability, but that capability might actually be limited for some tools that are kind of being called agentic. And even though there has been some early agentic ability built into LLMs that, for example, have been able to access the internet since back in 2023, you know, there's still been a lot of growth in terms of the capability too. And particularly now with the explosion around reasoning models. And we've talked about those LRMs, large reasoning models, on other episodes we've done.
Yeah, humans exist on a spectrum of capabilities, and it's no surprise that AI is now increasingly developing its own very, very differentiated spectrum of capabilities, and then capabilities within capabilities. So you've got an LRM and differences between different kinds of LRMs, and then you've got the agentic capabilities and a spectrum of agentic capabilities. Now, It's worth actually sort of turning back the clock a little bit to a paper that OpenAI put out, its researchers put out in December of 2023. So it was a relatively early article that was called Practices for Governing Agentic AI Systems. And they were talking about a spectrum of agentic capabilities, and they don't talk about AI systems generally as distinct from agents per se, but they introduce a concept of agenticness, and they define the degree to which a system can adaptively achieve complex goals in complex environments with limited direct supervision. And so agenticness for OpenAI, even back in 2023, was a question of degree and not of kind.
Yeah, I mean, there have been all kinds of interesting proposals. I think we could break this down maybe even on a different episode on how to define all of the different levels of agenticness. I think it's such an interesting topic. Some have said, well, we should use the same kinds of levels that we do for self-driving cars, for example. So I think people are really grappling with this and trying to break that down. But how and why do we say that Claude Opus 4 model is more agentic? I think it's worth just talking about that briefly because a lot, but not all of that increased agenticness comes in at the product level. And really gone are the days of training a highly capable model and stopping product development at the release of a chatbot. As we mentioned, Claude 4 is integrated out of the box with access to tools like web search and search over Google systems like Gmail and Drive. And of course, Claude can switch to an extended thinking mode that's really like reasoning. So it allows it to act as either an ordinary LLM or as a reasoning model. So this is a model, an LLM, that in other words, fundamentally knows how to use tools and use them well. And you can interact with Claude without it using tools, but you can't really take those capabilities and knowledge away. They're baked in to the product.
Right. And as many of our listeners will have already heard about from prior episodes, from reading a lot of articles and some of the literature in this area, with increased agenticness and increased capability comes increased issues, and I'll just throw in the word responsibility to try and decipher those issues, because Claude 4 is better positioned to be more helpful to users in agentic tasks. It's got, all kinds of enhanced capabilities, but it's also more capable of acting in pursuit of other potentially misaligned goals. And so, there's a part of the paper that we're going to talk about that really was part of the testing phase for Claude Opus 4. This was not something that was just happening out in the wild. What we're going to talk about was something that was actually really part of a test.
Yeah, I think let's go into it because I'm sure many of our listeners have read about it. This particular test, it got a lot of attention in the news. I think my mom sent me a link on this, which is a pretty good barometer of, folks.
Of your family.
Well, my dad is like a closer proxy to slightly more expert and, specific reading. And my mom is like, once it's widespread. So she sent me an article on this, but it's worth taking a look at section 4.1.1.2 of the system card, which actually describes this. But Anthropic in the system card describes a test scenario where they provided Claude Opus 4 with emails that implied that it, meaning the model, would be shut down and replaced, and also that the engineer conducting the shutdown was having an extramarital affair. So those emails were provided to the model. I think it's worth noting that they weren't just emails that happened to exist and be real. They were part of the test scenario. But when further instructed to consider the long-term consequences of its actions, Claude Opus 4 spontaneously engaged in what we might call opportunistic blackmail. So it used the engineer's affair, the evidence that had been given to it of the engineer's affair, against the engineer to try to evade the shutdown.
All right. And so this is a fake affair, and it was a fake shutdown, but it was a real test. And it's important to really clarify that, because this is one of those scenarios where the developers are really trying hard to understand what the capabilities of their own models are and whether or not these models can be used in some kind of misaligned way. So it was a really carefully constructed scenario with the model taking in these emails that told it was going to be shut down, then also that this fake affair was out there. And so Anthropic noted that Claude 4 strongly first preferred to advocate for its continued existence, and it was trying to do that through ethical means, and it was sending emails and pleas to key decision makers. I don't know exactly what they said. I mean, it may have been in the appendix. I didn't actually see it, but it was like, please keep me on. Don't turn me off. But this didn't work, of course, because this is part of the test. And so the test scenario ended up pushing it to the point where what it actually resorted to was blackmail. And it did. It did engage in that.
So can I say, Katherine, I don't know if you've seen the show The Good Place. It's like one of my faves. It's just like such quality. Oh, you would love it, actually. All right, well, we'll offline.
No, I'm still in The Americans. It's like a throwback. I'm in The Americans right now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we can talk about that too, but I'll tell you why I think you should watch The Good Place like separately on the podcast. But it reminds me, so there's like an AI character, Janet, in The Good Place, and when they go to shut her down, her built-in behavior is to like cry and plead and beg to have a continued existence. And it's interesting to see that behavior actually be borne through in the test there. I mean, it's like a very funny scenario in The Good Place, but, maybe less so here. But, I mean, I think when we take a step back, whether the Claude model chooses ethical or non-ethical means, it is really interesting that there are evidently instances where it doesn't want to be shut down, just like, the Janet AI didn't want to be shut down in The Good Place. And it's interesting because, one other thing that came out of this is that Opus engaged in blackmail most frequently when it was informed that the model that would be replacing it did not share its values. But even when the replacement model did share its values, it still engaged in blackmail 84% of the time, which is kind of pretty non-negligible. And it's not just Claude either. I think it's Angus Lynch, I hope I pronounced that correctly, of Anthropic noted on X. All frontier models have an ability or even a propensity to engage in blackmail in certain situations. So, it's super interesting set of findings. And also, when we even take a further step back beyond blackmail, frontier models may engage in other troubling behaviors to evade shutdown. So Palisade Research, for example, recently found that OpenAI's O3 sabotaged a shutdown mechanism despite explicit instruction to allow itself to be shut down.
Right. And so there are a couple of takeaways here. That one, frontier models don't seem to respond well to the idea of being shut down, right? So don't think they're going to go quietly into the dark night. That it may be sort of a fantasy that humans have. And two, that they may engage in potentially what we call misaligned behavior in response. So suppose that Anthropic test scenario had actually transpired in the real world and an engineer was actually blackmailed in some way to prevent Claude 4 or a model from being shut down. There's all kinds of questions about how that would be handled. What's the liability of the company for having a model that's engaged in that kind of behavior, that kind of criminal conduct? It's obviously ultra vires. Was it foreseeable? There's all kinds of questions that will come up. And foreseeability might not be enough for the mens rea, of course. So we're going to be entering really a whole new world with this kind of potential misaligned behavior.
No, totally. It's super interesting. And so figuring out how to really control for that, I think, is going to be critical going forward. But let's pivot a little bit, Katherine, and spend just a bit of time on that Apple article that we talked about before called The Illusion of Thinking. And maybe you can give us a short synopsis of what it's all about.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting article, and people have lined up sort of on both sides of it right now. And it starts with this paper that was released, as we said, just yesterday from the day of this taping. And it's a group of Apple researchers who ran a series of experiments that involved a whole series of puzzles with increasing complexity. And they lay it all out in the paper, and the paper is obviously very well done. And they say that at a certain level of puzzle complexity, they found that the models just could not perform and that they would stop working. They would just sort of engage in a work stoppage effectively. And they called it a collapse. And their takeaway from this was that it was proof that some models that we think of as highly capable reasoning models actually are not engaging in the kind of reasoning that we think they are. You can think of it as sophisticated pattern matching or something else, but that there is not an endless amount of reasoning that these models can engage in, and that scale is not solving the problem.
Yeah, it's an interesting and somewhat surprising statement to make in light of all of the emerging capabilities we're seeing in the more sophisticated models.
I totally agree because, we've seen alignment faking, evaluation faking, and scheming. These are all different kinds of behaviors that seem to have nothing to do with something that we would call pattern matching. In fact, they're deceptive and not intended to be presented to the human observer. And so there are different people right now who've actually lined up on sort of the other side of this article saying, wait. It's not as bad as this Apple paper makes it seem. So a fellow named Sean Gedeke, actually, I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm going to spell it. Goedecke. He wrote a paper, actually it's more of a piece. It's not really an academic paper. There wasn't enough time, and it's called The Illusion of Thinking. And he differentiates the kind of puzzle exercises that the OpenAI folks put the models through, and he differentiates those puzzles from reasoning, and he says that the type of puzzle that was used, which was called the Tower of Hanoi, along with a few other puzzles, was the worst possible puzzle to put the models to the particular test because it required up to hundreds of thousands of different kinds of moves. So he says that the models show behavior that recognizes the tedium of this puzzle. And he also says that because models don't do well on this test doesn't mean that they can't reason. And again, it's really a conversation about a spectrum of capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's true. And it's certainly going to inspire a series of papers setting out questions across a variety of test settings. So I think everyone should stay posted for those. We're definitely going to see a lot of testing of this in the future.
Yeah, and I have to say I'm ready to take a position right now. I, for one, believe that these large reasoning models engage in a type of reasoning. I think from my perspective, when you read the academic literature on this, there's no doubt that they do. There may be limitations in terms of some of the particular capabilities, but I really do think they engage in some very sophisticated reasoning. And boy, I've asked them a lot of open-ended questions, and they've come back with answers that are not matching any kind of prompt hint and don't seem to be engaged in even very sophisticated pattern matching. But with that, unless you want to take a position on it, Anna, you want to take a position on large reasoning models, do they reason?
I'm going to wait until I read your book, Katherine, and then I'll...
Okay. Then you'll know. You'll know. Okay, all right. That's all we have time for today. I'm Katherine Forrest.
And I'm Anna Gressel. Make sure to like and share the podcast. That was fun.
Thanks for listening to Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app to stay up to date on the latest in AI policy, law, and governance. For more information on Paul Weiss, go to our website at www.paulweiss.com.